Hello everybody, and welcome back to another Know Your Ship episode. And today's episode is going to focus on the Nelson-class battleships. In order to start the story about the Nelson-class battleships, we really have to go back to the end of World War I. At the end of World War I, Britain had the most powerful navy in the world. There was just a small problem. Britain was not in a very good place financially. World War I had cost Britain £3.25 billion in 1918 currency, and that's roughly the equivalent of about £203 billion today. Not only that, but the trading empire that Britain had before World War I that allowed it to basically become the world superpower of the day was in serious trouble. Countries lost access to British goods during the war, and so instead of waiting for Britain to start sending them goods sometime after the war was over, they just went ahead and started building their own goods. This, of course, had the side effect where once Britain came out of the war and went to the world and said, hey, let's start trading again, the world is like, yeah, but we have things that can compete with yours now. So, by 1920, Britain was in the worst recession that it had ever seen. So, how does this affect the world's most powerful navy, you say? Well, you need money to build new ships, and you need money to maintain them. And if you don't have money, well, you pretty much have to start giving up some of your older ships. So Britain started going around and scrapping the old tired ships while keeping the newer ships like the Queen Elizabeth class. While this would have eased the financial strain on the British economy, there was just one other problem: the United States and Japan. See, at that time, Britain was still the superpower in the world, and it didn't really see the US and Japan as friends. In fact, Britain envisaged a scenario where that it would actually go to war with the US over trade, and that meant fighting the US Navy, who, along with the Imperial Japanese Navy, was pretty busy building up a bunch of new ships armed with bigger guns than what the Royal Navy had. Not willing to surrender its dominance of the seas so easily, the Royal Navy went ahead and planned a whole bunch of new ships: the 4 battle cruisers of the G3 class and the 4 battleships of the N3 class. And they were designed to be better than the ships in the US and Japanese navies. Of course, by this time, the other nations themselves are starting to realize that, you know what, this is turning into another naval arms race, and in the long run, this is going to be financial suicide. So everybody sort of took a step back and went, you know what, we got to talk about this. So all the major naval powers met together in Washington in 1921 and signed the Washington Naval Treaty. While with the signing of the treaty, Britain lost its lead as the naval superpower in terms of the number of ships, but at least it was a welcome thing to the British economy. The treaty put the US and Britain on par in terms of tonnage, and behind them at 60% of the tonnage of the two countries in the lead was Japan. Britain was, however, allowed to build 2 new ships with 406mm guns in order to replace some of the older scrap ships and also to keep parity with the new US and Japanese battleships. And these 2 new ships would become the HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney, and they utilized some of the research and development that had been put into the G3 and N3 class ships. Both the Nelson and Rodney were laid down on the 28th of December 1922. Nelson was launched September 3rd, 1925, while Rodney followed 3 months later on the 10th of December 1925. Both ships cost roughly £7.5 million at 1925 levels to build, and when they were complete, well, the ships were seen as being pretty darn ugly and drew all sorts of nicknames. Some thought the ships looked a lot like the fleet tankers, so they called them Nelsol and Rodnell, following the naming conventions of the tankers, who all had "ol" at the end of their names. Some other people called these ships the Cherry Tree class since they were cut down by the Washington Naval Treaty. Some looked at the superstructure and said, you know what, those look like the Admiralty buildings in London, so they called them the Queen Anne's Mansions. And finally, when the ships were docked together, they had another nickname, which was a pair of boots, since at a distance, that's what they looked like, a pair of boots. The crews, however, came up with slightly better nicknames, and ones that I guess would be a little bit more affectionate. I mean, the Nelson was called the Nelly, while Rodney was called the Rod Box. Don't ask, that's just what they came up with. Anyways, let's talk about the ships in a little bit more detail. During World War I, the major naval battle that taught the British some serious lessons was the Battle of Jutland. And the Battle of Jutland basically taught the British that, you know what, firepower and armor protection are essential in capital ships, more important than speed and maneuverability. So the Nelsons focused on armor and firepower. In that sense, they did really well, actually. To maximize armor protection, the Nelsons were the first Royal Navy battleships to have all-or-nothing armor protection. Second, the Nelsons had all of their main guns forward in order to have the shortest armored citadel possible. That is a way to save weight, actually. Third and finally, the size and weight of the machinery was limited in order to keep weight down, but this of course did also lead to a pretty slow ship. The only thing that really kept the speed of these ships above the US standard type battleships was a very efficient hull that allowed the ships to attain 23.6 knots. Armor protection was fantastic. The Nelson's belt armor was sloped at 72 degrees vertically and was 360 millimeters thick over the magazines, which tapered off to about 330 millimeters over the machinery and secondary magazines. The ships also had 159 millimeters of deck armor that protected the ships against bombs and plunging fire. The main turrets had 410 millimeters of armor on the turret faces, 280 millimeters on the side, 230 on the rear, and 184 millimeters for the turret roof. The barbette was 380 millimeters thick. Now, comparatively speaking, because without comparison, these numbers are kind of worthless. If you look at the Nagato had a 305 millimeter belt, had 144 millimeters of deck armor, and a max of 305 millimeters of turret armor. Look at the Colorado, had a maximum of 343 millimeters belt armor, so kind of close to what the Nelson had, but only 89 millimeters of deck armor, and had a maximum of 457 millimeters of turret face armor. The Nelsons were substantially better when it came to armor protection. Maneuverability was actually okay. I mean, yes, the ships had certain issues when they were slow and in heavy winds, but generally speaking, out at sea, the ships were fine. According to the captains that commanded the Nelson-class ships, these ships handled well, and at sea, their turning radiuses were actually superior to the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships. Only, like I mentioned, in those previous situations where the ship was going very slow and there were high winds, that the superstructure caused a bit of a problem. However, as long as you were aware that that problem was there, you could easily deal with it. Firepower on paper was also on par, if not superior, to foreign battleships, but that is only on paper. The Nelsons had 9 406mm 45 caliber guns mounted in 3 triple turrets. However, performance-wise, these guns were only marginally better at penetrating armor than the older 351mm 42 caliber guns carried on the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships and HMS Hood. After a completely inadequate firing trial, the Director of Naval Ordnance decided that the high-velocity, low-shell-weight thing was a good idea that would lead to good armor penetration. And this is something that went completely against every single prior test. But apparently, they looked at the Germans and said they must have known something that we didn't, and they decided to go with it. By the time they ran another series of trials and went, oh, wait a minute, that's not what we wanted to do because the results are not good, it was too late. The high-velocity, low-shell-weight guns were already being fitted to the Nelson and Rodney. The guns themselves actually had penetration that was a little bit better than the 381mm guns, but here are their flaws. They had worse accuracy, worse barrel life, worse rate of fire. The poor rate of fire was actually a result of British experience during the Battle of Jutland, where Britain lost a number of capital ships because of flash fires. So the British afterwards examined the results and went, alrighty chaps, we're going to make sure that never happens again. And they absolutely went to town with precautions and interlocks to make sure that another flash fire wouldn't occur. So, well, from a crew's perspective, this was great in terms of actually getting back alive. Well, rate of fire-wise, not so good. In fact, while the listed numbers say 1.5 rounds a minute, at times it was as low as 1 round a minute. So imagine that, 60 seconds to reload a gun, where the 381mm guns on the Queen Elizabeth, you get 2 rounds per minute rate of fire out of those. So guns, not that great. So you think that that's all the problems with these guns. Well, not really. See, when they designed the ship, they sort of forgot something. The number 3, or X turret, when fully elevated, was pretty close to the bridge. So now imagine what happens when you start firing at max range with your guns, with the guns fully elevated. Not good at all. The windows blew in, shrapnel flew everywhere, and even when they fixed the problem near the bridge area, the other areas near the superstructure were still badly affected. The X turret was often restricted to only certain arcs and certain angles of fire in order to minimize potential damage. One admiral described the experience of basically having the guns fire right outside the bridge, this is before the fixes were implemented, as playing the role of a crash test dummy. So imagine the forces that you're dealing with there. The Nelson class's secondary guns comprised of 12 152mm guns in 6 dual turrets. They were meant to be dual-purpose guns, but with these kinds of dual-purpose guns, the traverse speeds tended to be really slow, and they were only really effective against surface ships. However, these were good for surface ships. The 152mm guns had pretty good range, and that meant that the Nelson could start firing at targets further away with its secondary armament than you could have done with previous types of secondary guns. The secondary guns, though, were grouped very, very close together on each side of the ship, right behind the superstructure, and the working spaces weren't very well armored. In theory, because of how close they are, one good shell hit could knock out all the secondary guns on one side of the ship. The Nelsons also carried 6 120mm quick-fire, high-angle AA guns and 2-pounder pom-poms as a way to defend itself against aircraft. Now, initially, when they were first built, there weren't that many, but as the war progressed, more and more of those AA guns were put onto the ship. One final feature that is rather unique to the Nelsons is the presence of torpedo tubes that fired pretty darn big torpedoes. Now, there was only one torpedo tube underwater per side, and they had a lot of reloads actually, but they fired huge 622mm torpedoes that carried almost 337 kilograms worth of TNT. These torpedoes would, guess what, inspire the Japanese to build the famous Long Lance torpedoes. Seems like the Japanese really like to copy things from the Royal Navy. Now, in service, these two ships had some fascinating stories, at least in the early stages of their life. In the later stages, it seemed a little bit more routine. So HMS Nelson started serving as the Atlantic Fleet flagship on Trafalgar Day, October 21st, 1927. Kind of an interesting day, considering the name of the ship. Rodney joined the 2nd Battle Squadron of the Atlantic Fleet a couple months later. They spent the early months doing exercises and battle practice. Now, for Rodney in 1929, command was passed on to Captain Andrew Brown Cunningham, who was one tough dude. The ship became a very, very efficient ship as everything was expected to be perfect, but mistakes were brutally punished. So the crew didn't really have that much fun aboard their ship. By 1931, when the Great Depression had already hit, wages were going to be cut, and so at that time, the junior ratings mutinied in what became known as the Invergordon Mutiny. On board Rodney, a piano was actually dragged onto the deck and the crew started singing. Orders given by the officers were respectfully ignored, although at times the officers were also ridiculed a little bit. There was also some disobedience on the Nelson, but it wasn't as bad as the Rodney. The mutiny was quickly resolved, but over 400 sailors relieved the service. The Atlantic Fleet itself would see its name changed to the Home Fleet in 1932 in an effort to expunge the memory of the mutiny. In April of 1932, Captain Cunningham of the Rodney was relieved by Captain John Tovey. Now, he is famous for being the man in charge during the sinking of the Bismarck many years later, and he immediately went about fixing the mood on board the ship. The fleet admiral aboard Nelson also tried to foster some friendly rivalry between the ships in the fleet by sending some very odd requests to all the ships in the fleet. On one occasion, asked all ships in the fleet for a fried egg, an exercise which involved not only the cooks but also the sailors who had to launch in a boat and row it over to the flagship. In early 1934, HMS Nelson ran aground on Hamilton Bank at the entrance to Portsmouth. This immediately led to some lewd comments about how Nelson was mounting a Hamilton again. If you're under the age of 18, though, please disregard what I just said. If you're over, please enjoy. Rodney would gain the benefit of this grounding, since she got to take the place of the Nelson on a cruise of the Caribbean. In 1935, Nelson was equipped to launch Walrus amphibious biplanes for scouting purposes. All things went perfectly well on the first flight, except the landing. The pilot on an amphibious aircraft had left the wheels down. So of course, when the plane hit the water, the wheels came right off. It ripped off the airplane, left a couple of big holes, and of course the plane sank. Whoops. In 1938, Rodney was the first British battleship to be fitted with radar. And she got radar over the flagship Nelson because, and here's where things in the Navy sometimes don't always make the most amount of sense. But the reason why Rodney got radar was because if they put the radar onto the Nelson, it would have caused the Admiral's flag to fly at a lower position, and that would have been an inferior position. Since that was unacceptable, Rodney got the radar set. And that was the first radar set on a British battleship. Anyways, okay, so with the start of World War II, both battleships would become extremely active, as they were, at the time, the most powerful British battleships. On September the 26th, 1939, both Nelson and Rodney would see action. They, along with the Ark Royal, went out to escort a damaged submarine, the HMS Spearfish. During this time, they were attacked by German aircraft. Absolutely no damage was done, but the Germans went back and reported that they had sunk the Ark Royal. Not only that, they had sunk HMS Kestrel, which is all fine and dandy, until you consider the fact that HMS Kestrel was a naval base. Yeah, seriously, the Germans actually claimed that they sunk a naval base at sea. On the 30th of October, U-56 tried to torpedo the Nelson, the Rodney, and HMS Hood. 2 out of the 3 torpedoes actually hit the Rodney, but failed to explode. The rudder was disabled, and this required repairs, which became more urgent when on the 4th of December, HMS Nelson hit a magnetic mine. The mine didn't actually kill anybody, but a large number of men suffered injuries to their delicate areas, mostly when their ceramic toilets that they were sitting on while they were doing their business shattered by the blast of the mine. Ouch. Repairs on the Nelson would take nearly 9 months, during which time she was fitted with a whole bunch of radar sets. Rodney, of course, during the time that Nelson was out of action, would see quite a bit of action. On April the 7th of 1940, Rodney, along with a large number of other ships, set out in an attempt to intercept the Admiral Hipper, which had just engaged and sunk the glowworm. But the hunt was unsuccessful. 2 days later, after failing to intercept the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, the ship was attacked by the Luftwaffe. Now, Lady Luck was gonna definitely intervene in this particular engagement. A 500-kilogram armor-piercing bomb was dropped on the Rodney. It hit the corner of a ready-use locker. Now this first hit on this ready-use locker, split the head and the fuse away from the actual bomb. Now the body of the bomb then punched itself into an engineering store. It made a hole, but it couldn't penetrate a 4-inch lower armored deck, ricocheted off of an armored bulkhead, and came back to rest on the armored deck. But because of that early lucky hit off of that ready-use locker, the bomb didn't explode. Had it exploded, it most likely would have actually detonated the forward 6-inch magazine, which was right next to the bomb, and somebody had left the hatch open. So Rodney managed to dodge her destruction there. In the first half of 1941, both the Nelson and Rodney would either be escorting convoys or attempting at times to engage German surface units. Now, the Rodney actually got close. While one time she was almost there, but the second time she was actually quite successful. On the first occasion, the Rodney received a distress call from a small armed merchant ship called the Chilean Reefer, which had been attacked by the Gneisenau. Now, imagine this. You're in a tiny little merchant ship displacing about 1,800 tons, and you have a single 102mm gun. So out comes a big German battleship with way more big guns, and even the secondary guns are bigger than what you have. What do? In most cases, you might want to consider running, but yep, the captain of the Chilean Reefer was like, hell no, we're going to go in and fight. So they popped smoke, they dodged fire from the Gneisenau's 283 and 150mm guns, and then returned fire with their solitary 102mm gun. Now the Germans were kind of like, what is going on with the ship? Do they have torpedoes? Do they have backup? What's going on? So under the command of Admiral Lütjens, yes, of Bismarck fame, they thought that the little ship was probably trying to pull something, so instead of getting close, they opened up the range and they pounded the tiny ship to pieces. Now Rodney, which got the distress call, came racing over, and she arrived on the scene, and, in the sort of poor light, she challenged the Gneisenau by signal lamp, who replied that she was the cruiser HMS Emerald, and of course realizing that holy crap, here's a bigger battleship with bigger guns and better armor, the Gneisenau promptly turned around and ran off at 32 knots, and by the time the confusion cleared, the Gneisenau was long gone. In May of 1941, Rodney was once again in a convoy bound for the US when word arrived that HMS Hood had been sunk by the Bismarck. Just a week earlier, Rodney had been alongside the Hood at Scapa Flow, so her loss actually came as quite a shock to the crew of the Rodney. Rodney immediately broke off from the convoy and set an intercept course for the Bismarck. During the chase, Rodney's captain had actually realized the error that was being made by the Admiralty with regards to the Bismarck's position and heading, and actually instead decided to try to cut the Bismarck off from reaching Brest. This proved to be the correct action, for when the Bismarck was finally spotted again by a Catalina flying boat, the Rodney was the closest ship behind her. Still, the Rodney wasn't exactly the fastest ship, so the Bismarck could have still slipped away had it not been for the Ark Royal Swordfish torpedo bombers, who disabled the Bismarck's rudder. At 0847 on the morning of the 27th of May 1941, Rodney opened fire first against the Bismarck. On her fourth salvo, she actually managed to hit the Bismarck, permanently disabling Bruno turret while temporarily disabling Anton. Then she pounded the Bismarck into submission. Hits from Rodney's 406mm guns destroyed the forward command post, killing most of the senior staff. The engine room was put out of action, and all the guns were silenced within 30 minutes. Still, Rodney and the fleet continued to pour fire into the Bismarck, which was still flying its colors. Rodney even managed to get a torpedo hit on the Bismarck, and this is the only time in history that a battleship would torpedo another battleship. By 10:16 that morning, Rodney ceased fire and turned for home, running critically short on fuel, as she had burned a lot of fuel going beyond even her top speed to try and catch the Bismarck. During the action against the Bismarck, Rodney had fired 378 rounds of 406mm shells and another 706 rounds of 152mm shells. HMS Nelson received news of the Bismarck sinking, and a week or so later, on the 4th of June 1941, she managed to sink a German supply ship, the Gonsenheim, which was actually supposed to have been the Bismarck's supply ship. 1942, there would be generally considered two rather significant actions. The first one, the Nelson, would be a heavy escort for a Malta-bound convoy that managed to get through, although with very, very heavy losses. Still, the few ships that managed to get through allowed Malta to stay in the war and stay outside of Axis hands. Rodney would continue to deal with problems with her steering and boilers that would just rear their heads sort of every once in a while, and she really desperately needed a full refit, but she was also really needed for the war effort, so crews and shipyards would just do their best to keep her going, quote unquote. The two sister ships would join up again in October of 1942 for Operation Torch and support the Allied landings of North Africa. 1943 would roll around, and once again we'll see Rodney and Nelson in action, this time supporting Allied forces in Sicily and Italy. They were expecting some sort of confrontation against heavy Italian units, but nothing came about as the Italian fleet did not engage British naval forces during that period of time. By the 29th of September 1943, the final armistice between Italy and the Allies was signed between General Eisenhower and Marshal Badoglio aboard HMS Nelson. Now, the war in Italy does actually keep going until 1945, but that's mostly because the Germans came in and sort of made a whole bunch of defensive lines and kept on fighting. But Italy's capitulation was done by 1943. Both Nelson and Rodney then returned to action in 1944 during the Normandy landings. Both ships provided excellent fire support to the troops on the ground, taking out concentrations of German tanks and infantry. Once the Normandy landings were complete, Nelson, on her way back to the UK, hit two magnetic mines. She just seemed to hit a lot of magnetic mines. Anyways, these mines again did damage, but no casualties. Nelson then made her way over to the US for repairs and upgrades in preparation for operations in the Pacific. Rodney's war, however, was pretty much at an end. She conducted some convoy escort missions in case the turrets came out, and these were the Arctic convoys, but that sole remaining mission was ended when the RAF bombed the turrets into the bottom of the Norwegian fjord with tallboy bombs. So Rodney eventually returned to Scapa Flow to pretty much sit out the rest of the war. Her problems with her engines and steering pretty much confined her to port. HMS Nelson did manage to see a few more months of action in the Pacific, but that mission too ended relatively quickly when the Americans went ahead and nuked Japan twice, leading to a very rapid surrender. Rodney was decommissioned in 1947, and Nelson followed her a year later in 1948, and by 1950, both ships had been fully scrapped and were off the face of the earth. Anyways, folks, I hope you enjoyed this story about the Nelson-class battleships. Once again, I would definitely like to thank my patrons for their amazing support. You guys are fantastic. I love you all so much. Your support allows me to keep doing these things, and I really hope that every time I make one, you guys enjoy it a lot. Anyways, folks, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to all of you again soon.